Hello there, welcome to Talking Europe on France 24. This week we are talking about a revolution, or was it? 50 years on from the protests, strikes and nationwide unrest that shook France in May of 1968, we're considering the legacy today of that legendary month. Now, what began with student demonstrations grew into nationwide wildcat strikes as the chaos spiralled. President Gaulle secretly fled to Germany, returning to call and ultimately win elections, though his personal popularity was deeply tarnished. Well, fast forward 50 years and France has a president who's made no secret of his ambitions to shake up the economy, while trades unions see Emmanuel Macron as a man who threatens hard-won social protections. We will be discussing all of this with our guest today, a former Europe Minister of France, now MEP Alain Lamassoure of the EPP group here in Brussels. Hello.
Hello.
Thanks for being with us. And we're also joined by Virginie Rosière from the Socialists and Democrats group. Hello there. Hello. French MEP and your party in France, the Radicaux de Gauche, the leftist radicals movement. Well, we're going to begin with a reminder for our viewers of May 1968 and the thoughts of some of the people who lived through those events. Thomas Waterhouse reports.
It began as a sit-in in the usually sleepy Paris University of Nanterre, but it quickly snowballed into weeks of violent unrest, some of the worst that France has seen. As workers downed tools en masse, growing numbers of students jumped on the bandwagon to voice their anger at the conservatism of the de Gaulle government. Sarah Makowski was a 20-year-old philosophy student at the Sorbonne when violence flared in May '68. She vividly remembers the moment when riot police moved in to clear the campus.
The police were walking up the Boulevard Saint-Michel in a big group, and we were hiding wherever we could. I remember I hid in the hall of a building, and what really hit me was the noise. Amid this incredible silence was the sound of boots on the tarmac. It was awful.
But '68 was as much a cultural as a political revolution. At the Beaux-Arts Art School in Paris, a new exhibition celebrating the posters and the slogans from 50 years ago has gone on display. But while these colourful cultural relics continue to draw in the crowds, some say the real spirit of '68 is slipping further and further away.
The street doesn't exist anymore. There isn't that culture of protest. People don't believe in it anymore. And then there's this disunity, which you see in lots of protests. If they're coming, I'm not going. Organizing something collective these days is a tall order.
Almost as quickly as the unrest flared, the barricades were dismantled and the flames of discontent died down. Even President de Gaulle, the man who so many had tried to push from power, went on to win at the polls. Yet 50 years on, another French leader is ruffling feathers. Some are even asking if May 2018 could be a repeat of May '68, as students hold fresh sit-ins and workers go on strike, this time in anger at President Macron's reform plans.
There we go, May 1968. If I come to my guest, perhaps you first, Alain Lamassoure. You lived through May 1968. What for you remains of May 1968 today?
First, I was a witness and an actor on the barricades in '68. I was at the end of my college. And I met Daniel Cohn-Bendit on the barricades, but we were not on the same side. It was fundamentally a kind of rebellion of the younger generation, the baby boomers. In France, immediately after the war, the birth rate increased by 1/3. And then when this generation came of age, of course, they wanted to rebel against the Gaullist power, which was an authoritarian regime. And what remains today is, well, the rebellion against the authority, the parental authority, the professorial authority, and a new kind of relationship between the generations. It's probably the most durable consequence of these events.
Well, it's certainly true that outside of France, France is seen as a country where there are lots of strikes, there are lots of protests. People visit Paris and they sort of expect to bump into a march or something. However, Virginie Rosier, if I come to you, does this still resonate in a meaningful way today? If we look at the May Day march of this year, there were between 14,000 and 55,000 people, depending on the police or the union numbers. That's not a huge amount for France on May Day. Is this, as we heard in the report, does the power of the street not exist anymore?
Well, I think the period is different. I was not a witness in May 68, but I think maybe, Alain, you left apart a dimension of the protest in May 68. It was also a social movement with huge strikes. And in the end, social progress with the raise of the minimum wage. So there were the two dimensions, of course, the society one with the youth mobilization, but also this more social mobilization. And for the moment in France, we've got these two movements, but not at the same level. We've got strikes and demonstrations in universities because there is a huge change of paradigm in universities with selection, and would completely change the role of universities in the way the young people can access to high-level education. And also there is a social concern with the strikes. And of course, on this 1st of May, it was, a middle-sized mobilization, but as you say, times is not the same. Now people are more insecure. At the time, in May 68, people were demonstrating to improve the situation. Now they demonstrate to avoid a degradation, a lower rights.
Lowering, yeah.
So the dynamics is not exactly the same.
Well, there is a great fear among many people that did not support President Macron in last year's election that he is going to attack social rights here in France that have been hard-won and are hard defended. President Macron really seen as an enemy for many people.
The situation was completely opposite in 68. A famous French journalist, Mr. Vincent-Pontet, in Le Monde, wrote a few weeks before May 68 a leading article, France is getting bored. Mm-hmm. There were no reform at all in France then. No unemployment. It was full employment for the young. Mm. And now, if there are demonstrations on the streets, it's against reforms, with a huge unemployment rate for the young. So, situations are not comparable, actually.
And President Macron, he described himself on a recent visit to Washington, D.C. as a dissident of the system. He did create his own political movement. Went alone, La République en Marche, now dominating the legislature. He's obviously the president as well. President Macron himself sees himself then clearly as somebody who's going against the old ways.
Well, I don't see him as a dissident at all. He's representative of the the best inserted people in society with high educations, high-level training, high positions in the public sector, in great banks, and then high positions in government, being minister. So he's not at all an outsider or a dissident. He's really a production of the most inserted people, the ones who feel less from the globalization, mm-hmm. and now the competition which is organized between peoples to try to pressure the social rights. So he's not really, well, you're speaking about reforms. As I was saying, what we can see is that the so-called reforms, they privilege the one who have the more, and with yesterday again the announcement of the deletion of a tax to avoid tax evasion, mm-hmm. Which will cost a lot to mm-hmm. public spendings. And at the same time, it's a lowering of workers' rights, less access to universities for young students, so less protection for unemployed. So
we're actually going backwards, you would say?
The dynamics and what you call reforms, it's very unbalanced, but quite trendy mm-hmm. politics, because it was already put in place in other countries in Europe, but it's not really what we would expect to be something very original or unusual.
Yes, but once all that is said, he overhauled our political system, and the political party we belonged to no longer exists. So we must be cautious. But can I come back to two lasting consequences, relatively unknown, of May 68? First, paradoxically, a reinforcement of the French state. In May 68, for some days and even weeks, the French state, the powerful French state, was on the verge of collapse, with President de Gaulle himself fleeing from France. So, immediately after, when de Gaulle regained power after dissolving the National Assembly and getting a huge majority, the French state has been reinforcing. And unfortunately, if France is today, for me, too centralized, is due to this fear of the French authorities to lose some power. Second lasting consequence, and you allude to it in mentioning this week's demonstration on the Paris streets, is this kind of legitimacy of the streets against legitimacy of the ballot booth. In France, whenever there is an election, democratic election, there is a democratically elected and legitimate power, but this power, a few months later, is questioned on the street by demonstrators.
So, well, final question then, just in one word. Do we believe that there still is power on the streets in France, Alain Lamassoure?
I hope not. I hope not. That now it will be a new chapter of French history.
Virginie Rosière?
There might be, we'll see in the coming weeks. But also I would say what's maybe a bit worrying is that the climate is not, the atmosphere is not the same as in May 68. It's a bit more tense. And also on society's issues, which were a huge step forward in May 68. Now we're facing very conservative movements. So maybe it's good that the streets can mobilize itself.
All right, well, we'll wait and see. There are plenty more strikes planned across France for the rest of the summer. We know that for sure. Thank you both very much. Just before we round off the programme, we have our regular fact-checking segment here on Talking Europe. This week, Frédéric Simon is looking into an article published by the British tabloid The Daily Express.
The European Commission wants to punish British citizens for leaving the European Union by restricting their access to Netflix when they travel across Europe. This is the accusation put forward by the Daily Express, an English tabloid newspaper, in an article published in March. The accusation is misleading, however, because it reverses responsibility. The truth is that after Brexit, Brits could indeed lose their right to the portability of online content when they travel abroad, a right which is currently protected under EU law. This law guarantees that consumers can enjoy their paid subscription content, such as football games on Netflix, everywhere in Europe, exactly like at home. Accusing Brussels of seeking to punish Britons by terminating those rights after Brexit is therefore dishonest at the very least. For many Twitter users, it is in fact the British who have punished themselves by deciding to leave the EU and the benefits that come with it.
Well, we just saw our fact check there about the Brexit. Just one last quick question, coming back to the revolutionary theme of our debate. A lot of people in the UK seeing leaving the EU, Brexit, as a revolution or protest of their own. Just a quick question. Do you see it that way? Brexit as a protest or a revolution?
Yes, but against whom or what? I don't know. I fear that Brexit is kind of a national suicide.
Virginie
I think
Rosière?
it's a protest, but I don't think it will lead to a revolution. I think there was a mistake in the target of some kind of anger, and I'm afraid it will turn against the people who were angry and not prove very useful in the end.
All right, well, thank you very much for those thoughts and for your thoughts as well on May 68, its legacy today here in France. Both of our guests, Virginie Rosière from the Radicaux de Gauche, which I mistranslated before.
It's more moderate left.
Moderate left, thank you very much. And also MEP Alain Lamassoure from the EPP group here in Brussels.
Moderate right.
Moderate right, there we go. Everyone's happy. Thank you very much for watching. We'll see you in part 2 of our programme just after the news.